The autopsy report used language that police officers don't forget. Spine shredded, liver ejected, heart never found. Those were the words used to describe what was left of James Streetman on the afternoon of the 23rd of August 2023 inside a sawmill on the outskirts of Phenix City, Alabama. A man who had worked in that mill for 20 years. A man who walked with a stiff gait, like he had a permanent crick in his neck, but was always smiling, always talking about his young granddaughter. That man was gone in seconds, fed into a spinning metal corkscrew called an auger, and there wasn't enough left of him to bury properly. And here's what you need to understand before we go any further. This was not an accident in any meaningful sense of the word, not a freak occurrence, not an unforeseeable catastrophe. It was the third time in 13 years that a man died at this mill. It was the predictable end of a documented pattern stretching back over 100 safety violations, multiple federal investigations, and fines totaling millions of dollars. The federal government had visited this place again and again and again. They had told the owners, in writing, this must stop. They had proposed fines. They had put the mill on a special watch list reserved for what regulators themselves called the worst of the worst employers. None of it stopped the corkscrew from spinning. The Washington Post would eventually call Phenix Lumber the deadliest workplace in America, the highest rate of fatal incidents per worker of any facility they analyzed across a 5-year period. And when you hear that, your first question probably is, how? How does a small sawmill in eastern Alabama earn that title? How does a company with over 100 federal safety citations keep its doors open long enough to kill 3 men? That's the question we're going to answer today. And by the time we're done, you won't just understand what happened at Phenix Lumber. You'll understand why it can happen anywhere that a padlock is too expensive to bother with. Phenix Lumber Company sits at 4 Cutrate Road in Phenix City, Alabama, a small industrial city pressed against the Georgia border, right across the Chattahoochee River from Columbus. The mill has been there since 1960, churning out southern yellow pine for the American construction industry. Framing lumber, dimensional boards, the kind of wood that goes into the walls of houses, the floors of warehouses, the bones of structures people live and work inside every day. For decades, Phenix Lumber was part of the economic fabric of eastern Alabama. The Dudley family, John Menza Dudley Jr. and Leslie Elizabeth Dudley, described by local reporters as one of the wealthiest families in the region, ran the operation. It produced millions of board feet of lumber annually. It employed dozens of workers, many of them men who struggled to find work elsewhere. The mill's own attorney would eventually argue in front of the city council that Phenix Lumber hired folks that other folks won't hire. That's a real thing to say about a workplace. But to understand what went wrong, you have to understand what kind of machines were running inside it, and what happens when those machines decide to move while a man is standing on top of them. Southern yellow pine doesn't come out of the forest ready to build houses. It comes out as a log, something that has to be transformed through a chain of violent industrial operations before it's fit to sell. At a mill like Phenix Lumber, that transformation never stopped. The boiler at the heart of it needed fuel around the clock, which meant the wood chip system ran around the clock, which meant the augers ran around the clock, which meant someone needed to be watching that machinery at 4 inches the morning, especially at 4 inches the morning. The journey of a log through a sawmill is a journey through escalating danger. Each machine in the chain is more specific and more unforgiving than the last. The corkscrew and the chipper. A log arrives at the mill, and the first thing that has to happen is debarking, stripping the outer bark away from the wood beneath. Debarkers use rotating drums and mechanical pressure to rip the bark off. They are loud. They vibrate. They are elevated platforms where men work. And at Phenix Lumber, those platforms had holes in them that weren't guarded. We know this because in the summer of 2010, about a week after one worker died, another broke his back falling 10 feet through one of those unguarded holes onto the debarker equipment below. The company had been warned about that hazard. They hadn't fixed it. After debarking, the log moves to the band saws. These are the primary cutting machines, tall, narrow blades, running in continuous loops that slice logs into what the industry calls cants, large rectangular blocks of wood. Then the cants move to planers, which smooth the surfaces. Then trim saws cut the lumber to final dimensions. At each station, workers are near blades, near pinch points, near moving parts that could take a hand, a finger, or more if something goes wrong at the wrong moment. A band saw blade runs in a continuous loop at several thousand feet per minute. There is no pause when it makes contact with something it was not designed to cut. It doesn't distinguish between a cant of southern yellow pine and the hand of the man feeding it. One worker named Weber, who was 28 years old and worked maintenance under James Streetman, later described what it was like inside. He'd worked construction. He'd worked a paper mill. He thought he knew industrial environments. He was not prepared for Phenix Lumber. The circular saws broke apart regularly, he said. Not occasionally, regularly. When they did, metal shards fired through the air and punched tiny holes in the mill's metal walls. Workers learned to read the saws by sound. When a blade let out a particular kind of scream, a pitch that wasn't quite right, they ducked. They had learned to duck because no one had fixed the saws. No one had installed the guarding that was supposed to prevent metal shrapnel from becoming a projectile. So men ducked when the saws screamed and hoped the timing was right. Hard hats and safety glasses were optional, Weber said. Not optional in the sense that the company had them available and some workers chose not to wear them. Optional in the sense that the culture of the place did not require them. Nobody made you. Nobody enforced it. You showed up, you worked, and what kept you safe was your own instincts and whatever luck you'd brought with you that morning. At the end of the cutting process, you have two things: finished lumber and waste. The waste sawdust, bark scraps, offcuts gets fed into a wood chipper. This is a machine that deserves particular attention, because the wood chipper is where Phenix Lumber's most savage moments happened. A wood chipper uses a high-speed rotating drum studded with hardened steel blades to reduce wood waste into small, uniform chips. The drum spins at hundreds of revolutions per minute. The physics of what happens if organic material enters a wood chipper unexpectedly are not complicated to understand. They are simply not something the human mind easily accepts. The blades do not stop. They do not jam on soft material. The machine was designed to reduce hardwood to small, uniform chips, and that is precisely what it does, regardless of what enters it. Those chips had to go somewhere. They went to the boiler, which powered the whole mill, and they got there via augers. An auger is, in its simplest form, a giant metal corkscrew, a helical screw blade wrapped around a central shaft, set inside a trough or chute, spinning continuously. The principle is, ancient Archimedes figured it out thousands of years ago. You spin the screw. Material at one end gets pushed to the other end. Grain, water, in a sawmill, wood chips. The auger at Phenix Lumber was set in what investigators described as an open-faced chute, meaning the top of the auger trough was not fully enclosed. You could see the corkscrew spinning inside it. Augers jam. This is not a rare event in a working sawmill, it's routine. A piece of wood that's too large, a clump of chips that compacts wrong, a scrap of bark that catches at the wrong angle. The screw can't move the obstruction, so it stops. Or the jam backs up the whole feed system and triggers an alarm. The fix is always the same. You have to get in close to the jam, remove what's blocking it, and let the system restart. In a facility with a proper lockout, tagout program, this means walking to the energy source, locking it out, clearing the jam by hand, removing your lock, and only then allowing the system to restart. Takes maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 for a stubborn one. At Phenix Lumber, it meant going in while the machine was live, because there were no locks, because there was no training, because the culture said you cleared the jam and got back to work. You could, if you needed to clear a jam and no one had bothered to teach you that you absolutely could not do this while the machine was running, reach in. Or, as James Streetman did on the 23rd of August 2023, climb on top of it. This is the moment to talk about the rule that Phenix Lumber decided did not apply to them. The rule that, had it been followed, would have meant that at least 2 of the 3 men who died at that mill would likely still be alive today. The rule is called lockout, tagout, and it has been federal law since 1989. When a piece of industrial machinery needs to be serviced, when a jam needs to be cleared, when a belt needs to be replaced, when a worker needs to reach into a machine for any reason at all, the law requires a specific procedure. First, you lock out the energy source. You walk to the electrical disconnect, the hydraulic valve, the pneumatic shutoff, whatever powers that specific machine, and you put a physical padlock on it, not a switch you flip, not a button you push. A padlock, your padlock, with your key, so that the machine physically cannot be energized while you are inside it. Second, you tag out. You hang a tag on that padlock with your name, the date, and a warning that the equipment is out of service and must not be restarted. That tag stays there. That lock stays there. No one can remove it but you. No one can restart the machine while you're working on it because no one else has your key. It takes maybe 2 minutes. It costs nothing beyond the price of a padlock and some tags. OSHA has required it for over 3 decades. Phenix Lumber never issued locks to their employees. They never trained workers on how to perform the procedure. Workers cleared jammed machinery on machines that were still live. Men reached into running equipment with their hands, their arms, their bodies, trusting that the machine happened to stay off for the few seconds they needed to fix whatever had gone wrong. And in a mill where machines broke constantly and jams were routine, and the overnight maintenance man was alone in the building at 4 in the morning, that trust was a very thin rope to hang your life on. They never locked out, tagged out anything. The culture of a workplace is built slowly, through thousands of small decisions that accumulate into a norm. When you work somewhere long enough, you stop seeing the dangers that aren't right in front of you. The machines jammed all the time, workers cleared the jams, the machines restarted. Nobody died. The routine felt safe because the routine was familiar, and familiar things feel predictable even when they aren't. At Phenix Lumber, the routine was to skip the lockout. Not because workers were careless men, not because they didn't value their own lives, because no one had ever given them a lock, because no one had ever trained them on the procedure, because the culture from the top of the company on down treated the 2-minute safety step as a production delay. And production at Phenix Lumber never stopped for delays. OSHA first put the mill under serious scrutiny in December 2010, following multiple employee complaints. Workers were calling in to report amputation hazards. Men were getting their hands caught in machinery. Then a finger came off a partial amputation while a worker cleared a machine that hadn't been locked out. Not in an accident nobody saw coming. In the entirely predictable moment when a live machine restarted while someone's hand was still inside it, doing exactly what the job required. Then, while OSHA was still investigating that, an inspector learned of another worker who had just suffered a severe hand injury on unguarded machinery. The mill was stacking casualties the way other businesses stack inventory. What OSHA found when they looked closely was systematic. It wasn't one machine without a guard. It wasn't one supervisor who'd gotten lazy about procedure. The violations ran through the facility. Workers were exposed to amputation hazards during maintenance. Machines were being cleaned and cleared without their energy sources controlled. Falls were possible from heights without any protection. And critically, the company had never even issued padlocks to employees. The tool required to perform the lockout procedure simply did not exist in the facility. In 2011, OSHA proposed $1,939,000 in fines. Egregious violations, willful violations. The kind of language OSHA uses when the evidence shows the employer knew what the law required and chose not to comply. The company's land manager told a local news station that Phenix Lumber was already struggling due to the economy. A $2 million fine might shut them down. It didn't shut them down. The fine was contested, negotiated, reduced, and the mill kept running. By the time the next major inspection rolled around, the violations continued. By 2020, when OSHA added Phenix Lumber to something called the Severe Violators Enforcement Program, a list reserved for employers who exhibit blatant disregard for safety regulations, the ones regulators flag as the worst of the worst. The company had accumulated 77 serious federal citations since 2007 alone. 77. That's not a pattern. That's a policy. But here's what makes this story different from a simple accounting of regulatory failure. The men who worked inside that mill knew, not in the way that a safety inspector knows, with a clipboard and a checklist. They knew in their bodies. They knew from the way the saws sounded before they blew apart. They knew from the metal holes punched through the mill walls every time a blade gave out. They knew from the auger jams that happened constantly, so constantly that clearing them was just part of the job, part of the routine. Something that happened at all hours, and you went and you fixed it, and you came back and you got on with your night. That knowledge didn't protect anyone, because the knowledge didn't come with the tools to act on it. A worker who knows a machine is dangerous, but has never been given a padlock and has never been trained to lock it out, has no protection. He has only the hope that this particular time the machine stays off while he's inside it. And hope is not an engineering control. Hope is not a safety program. Hope is what you're left with when the employer has decided that a 2-minute procedure is too expensive to implement. The men who worked at Phenix Lumber weren't reckless. They were adapting. When your employer never issues locks and never trains you on the procedure, and the people above you clear jams on live equipment every single time, you don't arrive at your shift thinking you're taking a gamble. You think you're doing the job. That's what makes safety culture failure so insidious. It doesn't feel dangerous until it is, and by then, for decades, that hope held. And then, 3 times, it didn't. Before we get there, and we're going to get there, because you need to understand what actually happened inside that mill, know this. Every accident that followed was not inevitable in the sense of being beyond human control. Every accident that followed was specifically preventable by a procedure that costs less than a cup of coffee per worker per day to implement. What was allowed to happen at Phenix Lumber was a choice, made at the top, paid for at the bottom. The day 3 men proved OSHA right. Charles Mercer was 52 years old when he went to work on a May morning in 2010 and didn't come home. He was installing a motor. The kind of task that requires getting close to machinery, getting underneath or around it, working in the tight spaces that industrial equipment creates. Industrial motors at a sawmill are not light. The components that move and support them are under load. A piece of machinery came down on his head. The record does not elaborate on what that looked like, but no one who has stood near sawmill equipment at operating weight needs it elaborated. What the record does not dispute is that Charles Mercer died at Phenix Lumber, that it was preventable, that OSHA found violations connected to his death, and that the response from the company was to pay a portion of the fine and continue operating. OSHA proposed $439,400 in fines for 53 citations connected to Mercer's death. In their press release, they used the phrase, for the first time, the phrase that would become a dark refrain across the next decade. This must stop. This exact language from this exact agency in this exact year. The mill kept running. A week after Mercer's funeral, another worker fell 10 feet through an unguarded hole in a platform at the debarker machine and broke his back, 10 feet onto industrial equipment. A fall that distance onto a concrete floor is serious. A fall onto rotating metal machinery is something else. The hole was there before Mercer died. It was there after. And a man broke his back falling through it because it still wasn't guarded. That's how confident the ownership was that the fines meant anything. That's how much they believed the federal government was going to make them change. For the next 10 years, the mill accumulated citations the way it accumulated sawdust constantly, without particular concern, as a byproduct of doing business. Hand injuries, amputation hazards, fall exposures, machinery without guards, workers clearing live equipment. OSHA was familiar with Phenix Lumber. Phenix Lumber was familiar with OSHA. The relationship had settled into something like a negotiation. OSHA proposes a penalty. The company contests or reduces it, everyone moves on, nothing changes. Brandon Lee Van Dyke was 34 years old and had a daughter named Braylin. He'd struggled, had a hard time holding jobs. He was in Phenix City trying to build something, working the overnight shift as the mill's maintenance man, responsible for keeping the boiler system running through the night. The boiler ran 24 hours a day. It needed wood chips continuously. The auger system that fed chips to the boiler needed to stay clear. When the auger jammed, the alarm sounded, and Brandon Van Dyke was the person who went to fix it. At 4:15 in the morning on the 27th of May 2020, the alarm sounded. A neighbor heard it from outside, the kind of industrial alarm that carried across the quiet of pre-dawn Phenix City. The wood chips had stopped reaching the boiler. Van Dyke went to deal with it. He was alone. He was in the dark. The power had not been cut, because at Phenix Lumber, the power was never cut before you went into the machinery. The auger often jammed, and workers had learned the fix: climb inside the silo, get in close, clear the obstruction, get out before anything moved. The auger moved. The neighbor grew worried when Van Dyke didn't come back. He walked to the mill. He looked near the wood chip silo. He found a disembodied arm. Police arrived at 5 in the morning and began a recovery operation. The Russell County Coroner's Office pronounced Brandon Van Dyke dead at the scene. The autopsy recorded multiple chopping injuries. Most of his remains were never recovered. He was 34 years old. His daughter's name was tattooed across his chest. He was trying to start from the bottom and work his way up. OSHA responded, 4 willful violations, 10 serious. They added Phenix Lumber to the Severe Violators Enforcement Program, the federal government's formal designation for employers who commit willful or repeat violations that could lead to catastrophic injury or death. The program triggers heightened oversight, more frequent inspections. OSHA used the phrase again, "This must stop." The mill kept running. In the 3 years that followed, OSHA inspected 4 times. The violations continued. Workers were still clearing machines without locking them out. Guards were still missing from equipment with known amputation hazards. The culture hadn't changed because the ownership hadn't changed. And the ownership had spent 20 years calculating that fines were cheaper than safety programs. And then came the 23rd of August 2023. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind of Alabama heat that makes the air inside a metal-roofed sawmill feel like a furnace. Weber was working his maintenance shift alongside James Streetman, Jimbo, 20 years in the mill. The supervisor, the man who knew every machine in the building by sound and feel, who walked with that permanent crick in his neck from years of bending into tight spaces, who smiled and talked about his granddaughter even when the work was brutal. The wood chipper had jammed. The spinning fan had clogged, and the auger below it, the corkscrew that moved chips up along the building toward the boiler, had backed up as a result. This was not an unusual situation. Jams happened constantly. The routine was to go deal with it. There was no procedure at Phenix Lumber that involved stopping to lock anything out first, because there was no lockout program, no locks, no training. There was just the jam, and the man who was going to clear it. Streetman climbed on top of the auger. He was trying to reach a difficult area, a spot that was hard to access from any other angle. The auger trough was open-faced, the corkscrew was exposed, sitting in its chute, visible from above. Remember what an auger does. It spins. It grips whatever is in contact with its threads and draws it forward along the shaft, compressing it against the walls of the chute. That process is relentless and instantaneous. There is no friction-based warning before it takes hold. There is no moment where you can pull back. To reach where he needed to reach, you had to get above it, get on top of it. Work from a position that put your weight over a machine that was live, that could activate at any moment, that had no sensor to detect a human body and no interlock to prevent startup. Someone switched it on. Or it activated on its own automatic restart after a power fluctuation or a system reset, the kind of thing that happens in industrial facilities. The exact sequence was never definitively established. What the autopsy established was what the auger did to James Streetman in the seconds that followed. His spine was shredded. His liver was ejected from his body. His heart was never found. Police body cam footage showed officers arriving and pulling back a red tarp that hung over a doorway. Beneath a small balcony, in an open chute, was the auger. James Streetman was 67 years old and had been at that mill for 2 decades. He was pronounced dead at 5:17 in the afternoon. Weber was nearby. After the mill was locked down and workers were interviewed, the shift supervisor, a man named Broadwater, walked up to Weber and asked him, "You coming back tomorrow?" Weber quit on the spot. OSHA's citation, released the following February, was the largest the agency had issued for a single incident in nearly a decade. 22 willful violations, 1 repeat violation, 5 serious violations, $2,471,683 in proposed penalties. The citation listed specific failures: no energy control procedures, no lockout, tagout devices, no training on how to control energy sources, unguarded machinery with known amputation hazards, fall protection absent in work areas above 4 feet. The specificity of the list was damning, not because it was unusual, but because almost every item on it had appeared in previous OSHA citations of this same facility, issued after previous injuries, paid for, and ignored. OSHA Regional Administrator Kurt Petermeyer wrote in the statement, This worksite has become all too familiar to OSHA. He used the phrase again. Third time in 13 years. This must stop. The Justice Department launched a criminal investigation into both Van Dyke's and Streetman's deaths. And still, until the city itself finally acted, the mill's response was to lawyer up and negotiate. You want to understand why OSHA couldn't stop Phenix Lumber? Here's the number you need to understand. The maximum penalty OSHA can impose for a single willful violation is approximately $165,000. That ceiling hasn't meaningfully changed since 1990. A company that produces millions of board feet of lumber annually, that has been operating for over 60 years, owned by one of the wealthiest families in the region, has been looking at a maximum cost of $165,000 per willful violation. For comparison, the maximum daily fine for a Clean Water Act violation is more than twice that. The federal government protects rivers from pollution more aggressively than it protects workers from being fed into corkscrews. The math for a profitable operation is not hard to do. Pay the fine. Keep running. Repeat. What a $165,000 fine can't buy. On the 5th of December 2023, 4 months after James Streetman's death, the Phenix City Council met and did what the federal government, across 13 years and millions of dollars in proposed penalties, had never managed to do. They voted unanimously to revoke Phenix Lumber's business license. The official reason was fire code violations. The mill had been using a water line that the fire department maintained for emergency fire suppression in their daily mill operations, pulling from a supply that was supposed to exist only to fight fires. It sounds almost bureaucratic, given everything else. But that vote was not really about a water line. It was about a city that had watched 3 of its residents go to work and not come home, and had finally reached a point where the math changed. The mill's attorney, Bill Finley, stood before the council and made the case for keeping the doors open. He said revoking the license was not a pro-business decision. He said Phenix Lumber hired people that other employers wouldn't. He pointed out that Christmas was coming and workers would lose their jobs. He suggested that other companies would think twice about coming to Phenix City if they saw how the city council treated a long-time local employer. Mayor Eddie Lowe was not moved. When it comes to safety, that has to be the #1 thing for any council. And I've heard and seen some disturbing things, and for that reason, I can't table it. The council voted. The license was revoked. The mill went quiet. The revocation didn't bring anyone back. It didn't retrieve what was taken from Brandon Van Dyke's daughter or James Streetman's granddaughter. It didn't undo 30 years of ignored citations, or restore the finger that came off in 2010, or straighten the spine that broke when a man fell through an unguarded hole in a platform. It closed a door that probably should have been closed much earlier. And it did so not because the federal regulatory system finally worked, but because the city which had watched this happen from the inside out had had enough. The Justice Department investigation into Van Dyke's and Streetman's deaths was still ongoing when the Washington Post published its investigation in February of 2025, calling Phenix Lumber the deadliest workplace in America and asking the same question that everyone who has ever looked at this story eventually asks. Why couldn't the system stop it? Why did 3 men have to die before anything permanent happened? Part of the answer is structural. OSHA is chronically underfunded. Its penalty caps have barely kept pace with inflation for 3 decades. A fine that can be contested, reduced, and absorbed into operating costs is not a deterrent. It's a tax. Phenix Lumber had been paying that tax since 2007. Part of the answer is cultural. A workplace where hard hats are optional and workers learn to duck when the saws scream has built its culture over years of small accommodations and silent acceptances. Workers who need jobs and can't find them elsewhere don't easily walk away. They adapt. They learn the rhythms of the dangerous machinery. They develop instincts that substitute for the safety training they were never given. And they hope, the way Brandon Van Dyke hoped at 4 in the morning before the auger moved, that this time the machine stays off. Part of the answer is just the distance between a padlock and the decision not to buy one. Lockout, tagout is not complicated. It is not expensive. What it requires is a decision at the top of an organization that 2 minutes of procedure is worth more than 2 minutes of production, that the law is not a negotiating position but an actual obligation. At Phenix Lumber, that decision was never made. Men went into live machines with no protection except their own instincts, and 3 times the instincts weren't fast enough. The mill at 4 Cutrate Road is quiet now, a sawdust-covered valley on the edge of town. As the Washington Post put it, a place that consumed wood, and men with equal indifference. The boiler doesn't run. The auger sits still. The wood chipper that took Brandon Van Dyke, that James Streetman was trying to unjam when the corkscrew started turning, that machine is no longer fed by men who were never given a padlock. Phenix Lumber produced millions of board feet of southern yellow pine over its 60-plus years of operation. Some of it is in buildings you've walked through. Some of it went into houses, floors, wall frames, structures that are standing right now all across the American Southeast. The lumber is still there, doing what lumber does, holding things up, carrying loads, doing its job in silence. The men who made that lumber are not all still there. Charles Mercer and Brandon Van Dyke and James Streetman made it too, and what it cost them was everything. There's a thing that happens when you read through the OSHA citations for Phenix Lumber from 2007 to 2023. Not the first few, not even the first 20. But when you get deep into them, when you see the same violation categories appearing in 2011, and again in 2014, and again in 2020, and again in 2023, when you see the same language about lockout and energy control and unguarded machinery appearing in report after report after report, you start to understand that the system was not failing to detect what was wrong at this mill. The system detected it constantly, inspectors saw it, investigators documented it, fines were proposed. The words, "This must stop," were typed into federal press releases and sent to reporters and entered into the public record 3 separate times across 13 years. What the system could not do was make the owners of Phenix Lumber believe that the cost of not stopping was higher than the cost of the fine. OSHA's maximum willful penalty of $165,000. The ceiling that hasn't meaningfully changed since 1990 was not, for a company producing millions of board feet of lumber annually, a crisis. It was an expense line. Paid, reduced through negotiation, absorbed. The regulations existed. The inspections happened. The citations were issued. And because the penalty could always be calculated against the profit, nothing changed at the machine level, where the auger kept turning and the chips kept moving and men kept clearing jams in the dark without a padlock to their name. The Justice Department investigation carries the possibility of criminal charges, something that civil OSHA penalties by themselves cannot produce. Whether that investigation ultimately results in prosecution is not yet known. What is known is that Phenix Lumber's doors are closed and that the Dudley family is facing federal scrutiny that years of OSHA fines never generated. There is a broader question embedded in this story that goes well past one mill in Alabama. It is the question of what regulatory enforcement means when the regulator's primary tool, the fine, is priced within the budget of the company being regulated. A $2.5 million penalty sounds significant, but against 63 years of operation and millions of board feet of production, It functions more like a business disruption than a consequence. When the penalty can be absorbed, the rational calculation for ownership is to keep running, keep appealing, keep negotiating, and write a check every few years as the cost of doing business. 3 men paid a different kind of price. Charles Mercer, 52 years old, hit on the head by falling machinery. Brandon Lee Van Dyke, 34 years old, whose partial remains were collected from a wood chip silo before the sun came up and whose daughter's name he carried tattooed on his chest. James Streetman, 67 years old, 20 years at that mill, walking with a stiff neck and always talking about his granddaughter, whose spine was shredded by a corkscrew that should have been turned off before he climbed on top of it. 3 men, 3 deaths, over 100 citations, millions in fines, and a phrase, "This must stop," typed into 3 separate OSHA press releases over 13 years without ever once stopping anything. They don't make excuses like that anymore at 4 Cutrate Road. The mill is quiet. The city council made a decision that the federal penalty structure had never forced the ownership to make, that the cost of continuing was finally too high. Whether the criminal investigation produces accountability commensurate with what happened inside that mill is a question that courts will eventually answer. What isn't a question anymore is this: 3 men went to work at Phenix Lumber and didn't come home. And every single time, the machine that killed them could have been shut off first. All it would have taken was a padlock. 2 minutes. A procedure that has been federal law since before Brandon Van Dyke was born. They never locked it out. They never tagged it out. And the auger kept spinning. That's what it cost. That's what it always costs when the people who own the machines decide that the rules don't apply to them, when they calculate that a fine is manageable and a funeral is someone else's problem. The tab doesn't come due in the boardroom. It comes due in the pre-dawn hours when an alarm sounds and a young man goes alone into the dark to clear a jam that never should have been cleared with the power on. It comes due at the end of a summer afternoon when a 67-year-old grandfather climbs on top of a spinning corkscrew because no one ever gave him a padlock and no one ever taught him why the 2 minutes mattered. It comes due every time. It's always the man at the bottom of the machine who pays it.